Hello everybody, welcome back to Bree's Science Lab. Today we're going over the arm and hand muscles. And today's video is going to be a different type of lecture. This is going to be a 2D lecture using pictures of models that I took rather than me pinning and pointing at the models. Before we start, however, I would like to go over a few things. It's important to remember the action words that we learn in the beginning of the semester, right? So if we go down and look at these cute little anatomy drawings we have today, you can see that flexion, demonstrated here on the left side of the patient, is a decrease of the joint. It is a decrease of the joint, the angle. So you can see that would be like doing a bicep curl, right? You are decreasing that angle, which would be your elbow. Now, if you look at the patient's right side, that is an example of extension, right? The green dot is showing you where the elbow would be, and you can see that it is completely extended at that joint, so a nice 180 degrees. That would be an example of extension, all right? Moving on, we now have adduction and abduction, which I like to pronounce as abduction, just so we can clearly hear that B, right? Now, on the patient's left in red, you can see an example of adduction. Adduction would be bringing your arm closer to your midline. How I like to remember this is I like to say that if you are bringing your arm closer to your body or closer to your midline, you are adding to the thickness of your midline. But abduction, abduction, demonstrated on the patient's right in green, is showing the arm moving away from the body's midline, so outwards. And how I remember that is I like to think that abduction is like you are abducting or abducting from your midline. You're making it thinner rather than adding to it. The reason I like to go over these in the beginning is because we are going to see some muscles that are named according to their action, and I'm going to briefly go over the actions of each muscle when we learn them. All right, now that we've gotten that out of the way, I do want to give you an overview of the entire arm model first so you know what we're working with. On the right side of the page, you are actually looking at the posterior part of the left arm, and on the left side of the page, you were looking at the anterior portion of the left arm. All right, and how we tell this is usually by the hand. That is the quickest and easiest way if the hand is available on the model. In anatomical position, our arms are out by our sides and our palms are facing forward. That means our thumbs are more lateral than our pinkies, right? Because our palm is facing forward. So if you can see the palm on the model, that means you are looking at the anterior portion. If you see the back of the hand or the thumb more medial, that means you are looking at a model that is either not in anatomical position, or you are looking at the posterior section of the model, which basically means the back. So how I would run through this if I were looking at this myself, this model, and I was being tested on it, first I would look for the hand, and the hand down here on the left image we can see is showing the palm, and we know that that means we are looking at the anterior portion. That being said, we know the thumb is also more lateral, right? So that would make this the left arm. Same goes for the right image. We know we're looking at the posterior part of the arm because we see the dorsum or the back of the hand, and the thumb is more lateral. That being said, it's also the left arm. This is the same model, just different images. Now that we've gotten the overview out of the way, we are going to look at the more zoomed in pictures of the models. We're going to focus on the upper arm first, and then we will move on to the lower arm, and then we will move on to the hand. And lower arm can also be called the forearm. It can be interchanged, just so you know. Starting off with the posterior of the left arm, we are going to go over this muscle right here. This muscle is the deltoid muscle. The deltoid muscle is a big abductor, abductor, meaning it does a lot to move your arm outwards, okay? That's one of its main jobs, is to move your arms up and out. So if you go to the gym and you do a lot of flies, depending on the version you do, you might feel that deltoid muscle getting really sore. Now that that's been taught, we are going to remove the deltoid muscle, right? Because it's covering a lot of muscles underneath it. So it's easier just to remove it. This image right here shows it removed and gives you a better view of the muscles underneath. To start, we are going to go over the rotator cuff muscles. Now, the rotator cuff muscles are the muscles that stabilize that elbow joint, your shoulder joint. And your shoulder can get dislocated a lot, but these muscles really help to stabilize it and try to prevent that from happening. The first rotator cuff muscle is actually the subscapularis, and it's found on the anterior portion of the arm, which I will show you on the next page. The second rotator cuff muscle is your infraspinatus. The third is your supraspinatus. And the fourth is your teres minor. Now, how I remember these is the mnemonic SITS. S-I-T-S, SITS. There are 4 rotator cuff muscles, and each letter in the mnemonic SITS stands for those muscles. S, the first S being subscapularis, the I standing for infraspinatus, the second S standing for supraspinatus, and the T standing for teres minor. Now, it's very important not to get these confused. There is another T muscle, the teres major, but that is not considered a rotator cuff muscle and is often used as a trick question. So the only rotator cuff muscles are the SITS muscles, subscapularis, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. The SITS mnemonic will help you remember that. Now, this muscle right here, you can kind of barely see it. This is the supraspinatus. Inferior to that, we have the infraspinatus. The reason they are named supra and infraspinatus is because this portion right here, this bone you see sticking out, is actually the spine of the scapula. So spine spinatus, that's where the muscles get their name from. This right here is the teres minor, the teres minor. Now, what we always say is minor before major. And while there are some exceptions to this rule, this will usually mean that the minor is found more superficial to the major muscle or more superiorly to the major muscle. So I like to say minor over major, and you can see here that the teres minor is over the teres major. The shoulder, we're going to get more into the actual arm muscles, and since we are looking at the posterior side of the arm, we're going to be looking at mostly extensor muscles, okay? Extensor muscles are found on the posterior part of the arm. And extensor muscles, again, will be extending out that elbow joint, right? Extending it out or increasing that joint. So if you're ever in the gym, you do those tricep extensions, the muscles doing that are the extensor muscles. And these muscles are found on the posterior part of the arm. You probably have heard of them before. They are the triceps. There are 3 heads, and I will point out those heads to you now. This right here is the triceps brachii long head. Triceps brachii long head. Now, triceps is because it is on the posterior side. It's an extensor. There's 3 heads, right? So we know why it's called triceps. Brachii refers to the brachial region, which is the arm region. So triceps brachii long head. long head. And then if we moving on to the next triceps muscle, we are going to come to the triceps brachii lateral head. Triceps brachii lateral head. Don't get this confused with the triceps brachii long head. The long head is this one right here, and the lateral head is this one right here. Triceps brachii lateral head. So they both start with L on that third word, but to help you remember, this muscle is more laterally because this side is the lateral side. You have one more triceps muscle because there are 3 in total, and it's this one right here. You can kind of barely see it, but it is there. It's more visible from a different view, a more medial view. This one is your triceps brachii medial head. Your triceps brachii medial head. And it's a lot smaller than the other ones, but it's there, and it makes up the last part of your triceps. Now, if we move more laterally, so more outwards, which would be towards the left of this image, we're going to come to the brachialis. And this is rather a wide muscle, so you can see it from many different views. So this right here is the brachialis, and this right here is also the brachialis, just with that deltoid out of the way. Now, the brachialis is a fun one because it is one of the few that is innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve. So that's a fun fact we'll get to a little bit later. But this muscle next to it, or rather on top of it, or more superficial, depending on how you look at the arm, is actually going to be the first biceps muscle you come to. Now, the biceps are responsible for flexion of the elbow joint. Flexion means you are decreasing that angle. So to give you an example, if you were at the gym and you were doing bicep curls, you would be bringing that weight closer to your shoulders, requiring you to bend your elbow, which means you would be flexing that joint. So that decrease is made possible by your bicep muscles, your biceps. If we break that down, bi stands for 2, so biceps means there are 2 head rather than the triceps we saw with 3. The first biceps muscle can actually be seen right here. This is the biceps brachii, because in the arm region, long head. Biceps brachii long head. All right. Now, we can actually move even more laterally. This last image right here on the far right shows you both biceps muscles. So this right here again would be that biceps brachii long head, which is closer to that brachialis muscle. And this gives you a better view of how the biceps muscles sit on top of that brachialis. You can see kind of right here how it just sits on there. More medially to the long head, you would find your biceps brachii short head, the biceps brachii short head. And I say that it's more medially because now we're getting closer to the anterior view of the arm. So this over here would be the more lateral side. Over here would be the more medial side. This is the side of your pinky. All right, this is the side of your thumb over here. Moving on, you can actually see it from this view too. This is an anterior view of the same arm muscle model, but it has the deltoid right here on this one. And you can kind of see that from this view, you would see mostly just the biceps brachii short head rather than the long head, which is more laterally and partly covered by the deltoid. If we move more medially, so that would be more leftwards on this image, we come to your coracobrachialis. Coracobrachialis. And for some reason, this was one of the easier ones for me to learn because I thought it was such a fun word and it was kind of out of nowhere. This muscle is just like going straight down and it's the only one in that group, so I thought that was fun. So this is your coracobrachialis. Coracobrachialis. If you look to the left of the coracobrachialis at the shoulder region, you see that first rotator cuff muscle that I mentioned. That is your subscapularis, And your subscapularis actually sits on the subscapular fossa Your shoulder blade bone. This is the first rotator cuff muscle, so it was that first S in the sits mnemonic. You can also see your teres major here at the bottom and even a cut of the latissimus dorsi, which is one of your back muscles, all right? But I highly doubt you will ever be asked what this cut is. But if you are, it is the latissimus dorsi. And we can see another muscle here that we didn't see on the back. This is going to be your subclavius muscle right here. This is your subclavius muscle. Now, your subclavius, if we break that down, sub meaning below, and clavius referring to the clavicle, okay? Your clavicle is like your collarbone, and as it runs below it, sub meaning below, okay? Your clavicle is like your collarbone, and as it runs below it, sub meaning below, so subclavius muscle would be the muscle below your clavicle, which is this bone here. Going back down to the more of the arm muscles, leaving those shoulder muscles behind, we can see the brachialis right here with the bicep muscles removed as well as the deltoid, and that gives you a really clear view of that brachialis muscle. So it's this one right here, and this is the nerve I was telling you about that runs directly over the brachialis, which usually means it's going to innervate that muscle. So if you ever see a nerve running over a muscle, it generally means it's going to innervate that. And if you're new to my videos, innervate basically means it is what tells that muscle to move. It's what excites that muscle and allows it to get signals. And if you look over here, you'll notice a muscle we already went over. This is your triceps brachii long head. Your triceps brachii long head. And I know that's funny, your triceps are on the back of your arm or the posterior side of your arm, but like I said, you can see a lot of these muscles from different views, so you just want to be aware of what view you're looking at and what muscles you might be able to see spilling over on the sides. We move on, that you can also see the brachialis muscle right here, okay, before we remove those biceps. So that's another example of a muscle you can see spilling out on the sides of two different sides. So you can see it when we remove the biceps. You can also see it on the left side of the biceps as well as the right side of the biceps. Now, if we move down, we're going to be looking at the forearm now, okay? So this is the more distal portion of the arm, and it gets a little bit more complicated here. A lot of these muscles will probably sound new to you because you don't usually hear about these muscles when you go to the gym and stuff like that. So a lot of them are kind of funky, but I'm going to show you how to break it down and make it really simple, starting with the anterior portion of the arm. The forearm specifically. Now, this anterior portion will be the side that is on the same side as your palm, right? Because we're talking about anatomical position. And it gets a little scary looking, but I use a mnemonic that I like to say pass, fail, all over fail, right? Now, do not worry, okay? You are not going to fail any test, especially not an anatomy test, but that is a good way to remember the anterior muscles of the forearm. So I'll go ahead and write it here. P for pass and F for fail. So pass, fail, all over fail, right? Now, the reason we say this is because a lot of these muscles are either going to start with a P or an F, right? So this is your first muscle right here. You're going to start on the side of the thumb, so the radial side or the more lateral side. And this is known as your pronator teres. Your pronator teres, okay? Now your pronator teres is obviously going to pronate your arm, so pronation, right? And pronation is the opposite of supination. If you haven't gone over this before in one of your classes, supination is basically turning your forearm from your palm down to your palm being up. So think of it as like you're cupping your hand and holding a bowl of soup in your hand, right? So supination means you're able to hold a bowl of soup in your hand. So if you cup your hand and you hold it out like you were asking for soup or something, right? Pronation, think of it like pouring out that soup. So now you're going from a palm up position to a palm down position. All right. And that is basically twisting your forearm to where those two bones are going to cross over each other, right? So that is supination versus pronation. So if you hear pronator teres, you know that it's going to be a pronator muscle. And you also have a supinator muscle, which will do a lot of supination. But that's just the first muscle. And that muscle, the pronator teres, is going to be the first P in our mnemonic, right? So pronator teres is pass. Then if we move more inwards or more medially, right, we get to our first F. And this is going to be your flexor carpi radialis. Flexor carpi radialis. Okay, that's our first F in the mnemonic. Now, let's break that down, right? So flexor, because it is on the anterior portion of the arm, right? And we know that on the anterior portion of our arm, we're going to find flexors, which are responsible for decreasing the angle of a joint. Now, because we're on the forearm, we're no longer acting on our elbow joint. We're actually going to be acting on our wrist joint, right? Usually a muscle will act on the joint below it, okay, or more inferior to it. There are a few exceptions, but this is a general rule. So that flexor carpi radialis, right? So we know why it's called a flexor. Carpi, because if you follow it down, you'll notice that the tendon goes down to the carpal region, okay? Those carpal bones, those are your wrist bones. And then radialis, okay, flexor carpi radialis, because you are on the radial side, which is the thumb side, right? Because of that bone, the radius, which is on the more lateral portion. And that would be our first F. Now, if we move more medially again, we get to this muscle right here. It's labeled number 24. This muscle is going to be our second P, and this is your palmaris longus muscle, your palmaris longus muscle. Now, this is a really funny muscle because actually a lot of people don't have it. Some people do, but a lot of people don't. And it just kind of depends. You can have it in one or both arms, or you can have it in neither arms. It's just an evolutionary thing. You know, some people have evolved to not have it, but it is also important because of its tendon. So the palmaris longus tendon, if you notice, it is the only tendon that goes over this white portion right here. This white little portion labeled number 46 is actually your flexor retinaculum. Your flexor retinaculum, because it's on that flexor side, and you'll notice it's the only tendon going over it. That flexor retinaculum is acting as a part of the wall of that carpal tunnel, basically. So in carpal tunnel syndrome, where that area gets super, super tight or swells up or gets inflamed, right, your palmaris longus tendon, if you have one, would not be affected because it is not going through that carpal tunnel. Instead, it goes over the flexor retinaculum, which acts as one of the walls. Now, we are going to move even more medially. Now we're pretty much on the medial side, the pinky side, the ulnar side, the digiti minimi side, whichever helps you remember, right? And this is going to be our second F. Second F in the mnemonic, right? This is going to be your flexor carpi ulnaris. Flexor carpi ulnaris. It has a similar breakdown as the flexor carpi radialis. Flexor because it's on the flexor side, carpi because the tendon's going down to that carpal bone, and then ulnaris because it is on the ulnar side, or the side of the ulna, which is the other bone in your forearm. Now, that was your pass, fail, right? PF, PF. But our whole mnemonic was pass, fail, all over fail, right? So I like to draw it with like a line under the PF, PF, as you see here, and then put fail underneath it, because the last F in the mnemonic, the last fail, is actually going to be this one right here, which is deep to the other ones we were discussing previously. So it's under. Pass, fail, all over this more deep layer right here, which is your flexor digitorum superficialis. flexor digitorum superficialis. And I know that's kind of funny because this is not the most superficial muscle you see on the forearm, but you have a flexor digitorum profundus, which is underneath this flexor muscle, so that's why this one is given the name of flexor digitorum superficialis, and the one underneath it, this one right here, is the flexor digitorum profundus. And so what some people like to say is profound is underground, so it's underneath, it's the most deep layer, and that's right here. This muscle right next to the flexor digitorum profundus is actually going to be your flexor pollicis longus. Your flexor pollicis longus. And below that, you'll see your pronator quadratus. So again, that pronator quadratus is going to have a little bit of something to do with pronation. And I will give you guys a hint when you are learning these. You'll notice a lot of the muscles in the forearm will have the word longus in the name. Now, that's a general rule, but the longest muscles, okay, will be seen in the forearm, and the corresponding brevis muscles will be found in the hand. So you'll have a flexor pollicis brevis in the hand, but your flexor pollicis longus is this muscle right here in your forearm. You'll see kind of the same trend when we get to the leg muscles. You'll see the longest muscles in the calf region, while you see the brevis muscles more in the foot region. Now we can go ahead and move on to the posterior side of the forearm. Now, this side was one of the more difficult ones for me to actually learn, and I didn't really get the hang of it until I tried to figure out my own tips and tricks to help remember it. A lot of people will teach an EEA mnemonic chart, and you can find this on Google Images. It's super easy, super quick to look up. But it's basically a chart, and it goes over like, oh, this is an extensor, this is an abductor muscle, this is an adductor muscle. However, I found it really difficult to use, and it didn't quite help me. It kind of confused me more. So I came up with my own way of remembering it, and I'm going to share that with you today. We're going to start on the pinky side of the arm. This is your extensor carpi ulnaris. Most of the muscles you see on the posterior side of the forearm are going to be extensors, and they're pretty much named accordingly. So that would be your extensor carpi ulnaris. It kind of has a similar breakdown as the ones we saw on the anterior side. Extensor because it's an extensor, carpi because it's going to that carpal area, and ulnaris because it's on the ulnar side, which is the pinky side. If you move more in, that is your extensor digiti minimi, your extensor digiti minimi. And how I remember it is it's super, super tiny. It's really mini, right? If you see, it's not even wide at all. And that's your extensor digiti minimi. It's called this because the tendon goes down to the digiti minimi, also known as your pinky, which I think is a really cute way of naming the pinky, right? So that pinky is the digiti minimi, and since the tendon goes down to it, it's called the extensor digiti minimi because it extends your pinky. Now, how I remember the names is basically I look to where the muscle is going and where its tendon is connecting, and I think they're pretty easy once you break down the name and you can see where the tendon is going. And that is going to help you remember better than any mnemonic, I think, for this posterior side. Moving on, we're going to get to this muscle right here. This is also an extensor muscle. This is the extensor digitorum. So that is your extensor digitorum. So breaking it down the way I have been for the other ones, extensor because it's an extensor, and digitorum is because if you follow the tendons down, so these three right here, you'll notice it's going to the ring finger, the middle finger, and the pointer finger. So your three main digits, right? Extensor digitorum, digitorum referring to the digits. So that's how I remembered that one. It basically just followed the tendon again. Now, we're going to get to this one right here, and this one is another extensor muscle, right? This one is your extensor carpi radialis brevis. All right, extensor carpi radialis brevis. This one right next to it is the extensor carpi radialis longus. So, like I said previously, there is an exception to that longus brevis rule I was telling you guys about, and this is one of them. So, brevis, how we're going to remember this one, is the brevis is in the crevice, right? So, the brevis is in the crevice, and then longus is just right next to it. And those are all extensor muscles. So that's how I remember them. They're all named starting with extensor, and then the second and sometimes third part of the name is named according to where it's going, specifically its tendon, right? You'll also see right here, this is your anconeus. Your anconeus, it's kind of cut off in this image, but if you look down here, you have a better view. This is your anconeus near that elbow region. It's just kind of a muscle that's thrown out there, right? It doesn't really fall under any category. It's just there. Now we're going to get to the more deep layers, right? So you notice here, right, there's two muscles right here that are going underneath these more superficial muscles. And a lot of people will teach them on the same layer as the superficial muscles, but I find that really difficult, right? I prefer to learn these in sections, specifically layers, right? So we're going to take that top piece off of muscles, so that extensor digitorum, the extensor digiti minimi, and the extensor carpi ulnaris. We're going to take those three muscles off and look at what's underneath them. So this second image is showing you what's underneath them right here. Now, these two are the same ones that you could partially see when the entire model was together. This one right here is your abductor pollicis longus. Abductor, abductor, pollicis longus. Now, we're going to go ahead and break that name. Abductor, abductor, means you are abducting away from the midline. And specifically, we're referring to the midline of the hand, which means it's going to bring whatever digits connecting to outwards, away from the hand. And we know which one it's talking about, which digit specifically, because of the second part of the name, which is pollicis. Abductor pollicis longus. Pollicis is actually referring to your thumb. Your thumb is known as your pollex, okay? Your pollex. So pollicis or pollicis is basically talking about your thumb. So, abductor pollicis longus, because it's the longest muscle, you'll see that brevis one when we get to the hand. Next to it, we're actually going to have another extensor. So how I remember this one, the extensor indices, is I basically run through the rest of the muscles, right? Next to it, you're going to have your extensor pollicis brevis. Extensor pollicis brevis. Now, I know that's weird because we're in the forearm, but again, this is another exception. There's not many, I promise, but it is one of them. And your extensor pollicis longus is also going to be here, and it's this muscle right here, kind of hidden, but it's there. And you're going to wonder, why is it longus? It looks a heck of a lot smaller, right? Well, if we actually follow the tendon down, all right, it's this tendon right here, and as it goes down, you see it goes way, way, way far. So it's super long. So that's how I remember that one's the longest one, even though the muscle looks a little smaller. So how I remember this one, the extensor indices, is I basically run through the rest of the muscles, right? Because this one's kind of hidden, you might forget about it. And so how I remember it is I'm like, okay, well, we have an extensor for basically everything else already. So what's left, right? So we already had our extensor digiti minimi, right? We had our extensor carpi ulnaris. So we have the ulnar side covered, we have the digiti minimi covered. We already went over the pollicis ones. So your pollex is covered, your radial side is covered. So everything's covered. You even have the digits mainly covered, right? Because we had that extensor digitorum. But you're going to need a lot more control over that index finger, right? Okay, it does a lot more than your middle finger or your ring finger. So I'm like, what's left? And what's left would be that index finger. It's going to need another muscle. So that being said, your extensor indicis. Then this muscle right here, this super, super big one, this is actually your supinator, right? Your supinator. So it's responsible for supination, which again is basically turning your forearm from palm facing down or palm facing posterior, right, to palm facing up or palm facing forward, right? So you're basically straightening out the bones in your forearm rather than crossing them over. How I remember it is you basically are able to hold a bowl of soup in your hand if your hand is in supination, right? But you'd be pouring it out if you flipped your hand over and poured out the soup, right? Now, you have this muscle right here. Now, that covers all of the muscles on your forearm. So we are done, and that is considered the more difficult portion of the arm muscles. I do want to point out one last thing though. If you look back up at that top image, this is your extensor retinaculum. Your extensor retinaculum. Your extensor retinaculum is just like that flexor retinaculum, but it's not as important. You probably won't hear about it as much in class unless they're asking you which one the palmaris longus tendon goes over. But just remember, palmaris would be on the flexor side, right? Your palm. So you would just know it was your flexor retinaculum. But other than that, your extensor retinaculum, nothing too special, nothing you will likely be tested on, but I would know that it's there. Now we're going to go over the hand muscles, and we're going to start with the palm because it has more muscles on it. And I put two views, all right, because we're going to use a mnemonic I like to say as Oophala. I learned this when I took anatomy, and Oophala is spelled out O-A-F, Oopha, A-L-A, all right, Oophala. And this is for the hand palm muscles, right? And it actually starts on the far, far side of the thumb, right? So this one right here. But you can't see it if you're just looking at a palm view because it's so far on the side. But this is your first one. It's going to be that O in Oophala, and it's your Opponens pollicis. Opponens pollicis. Then you're going to get to the A, which is this muscle right here. But if you're just looking at a palm view, it'll be this first muscle you see right there on the edge. And that's going to be your abductor pollicis brevis. Abductor, abductor, pollicis brevis. All right, if we break that down, abductor, pollicis, right? So we know pollicis is going to be that thumb. And abductor means you're bringing it outwards from that midline, outwards, you're abducting it away. And that means that this muscle is going to help move your thumb outwards, okay? Move it outwards away from your other digits. And brevis just means it's not the longest muscle found in the hand, right? Now, we went over OA, right? Oopha. So we are at the first F. Or the only F actually. And that one's going to be your flexor pollicis brevis. Flexor pollicis brevis. So that one's a pretty easy one to break down. It's going to flex your thumb and it's in that hand area, right? Now, Oophala. We are back to the second A, right? So this is the second A, and this one's actually going to be your adductor pollicis. Your AD, as in dog, adductor pollicis, okay? That being said, we can break that one down pretty easily. There's only one of them, so there's no brevis or longus. Adductor means to add to that midline, right? So you're bringing your thumb inwards, bringing it in. So that is that muscle right there. But be careful because right here starts a different muscle. Okay, so down this line right here, if I were to pin to the left of this line, all right, that would be a lumbrical muscle. So technically, all of these muscles right here are referred to as your lumbrical muscles or your lumbricals, and this is actually Latin for worms. I guess the person who discovered it thought that the hand muscles looked like worms, and I guess they kind of do, but lumbricals, that's how you got it. Now, Owafala. So we did the L. Now we have one more A in the hand, right? And it's actually this one right here. This is your abductor digiti minimi. Abductor digiti minimi. If we break it down, we already went over how the pinky is known as the digiti minimi. Abductor means it's going to be abducting away from that midline, so it's bringing your pinky outwards from your other digits. And I don't know about you, mine doesn't work too well. Maybe some other people are better than me at moving their fingers, but I can hardly move my pinky outwards, so mine must not be doing a very good job. But that is your abductor digiti minimi. Now, I put a small image down here of the back of the hand or the dorsal part of the hand or the posterior part of the hand, right? And that's only because all of these muscles can be referred to as the dorsal intercossi muscles. Dorsal intercossi muscles. And that just refers to intercossi. It's saying in between these little bones right here, intercossi. Dorsal intercossi muscles. Now, that is all we have for the muscle models of the arm and hand. Now, that was not too bad, right? I would recommend probably going over the bone video first if it has already been uploaded or when it is uploaded, but that is a great way to start. And after, I would recommend quizzing yourself, trying to teach it to other people, watching this video a few times. You can even put it on 2 times speed if you want to go a little quicker for a quick refresher. And I will also be uploading a crash course of this where I will just go through and pin and point at the muscles for a quick review if you are late to class or something, or right before your test, whatever you need, right? And I hope that helped. Thank you for watching Bree's Science Lab, and stay tuned for our next video.